Everyone, this is Kelsey. As you may have heard, I am no longer with the score, hence no overlay again. Just for a little bit, I'm going to be doing some videos on my own channel until it's kind of finalized where I'm ending up, etc., etc. But I want to still keep doing content because I literally cannot help myself. It's just a thing that I have to do. What I want to talk about today is really pertinent because we're in the middle of off season, right? We're in full swing of off season, and everyone's talking about like these really sick Korean junglers that people want to import, want to make sure they snatch up really quickly. And my opinion is actually that the jungle is the worst role to import with a language barrier. Sure, there's a difference between importing a European jungler if you're an NA team or an NA jungler if you're a European team and everyone speaks English, and that's fine. But if you're a Chinese team importing a Korean jungler, or a European team importing a Korean jungler, or an NA team importing a Korean jungler, I often find it's really tricky. I think it's actually probably the worst role to import, or a Brazilian team importing a Korean jungler. I've interviewed a lot of junglers. I've interviewed Winged, I've interviewed Dandy, I've interviewed Cacao, a bunch of them about how important it is to be able to communicate with your lanes, and the fact that as a Korean jungler going to another region, it was really hard for them. You saw a lot of inconsistencies in Cacao's play, for example, on IG games where he just did nothing, which wasn't necessarily inconsistent with his KT play, but it happened much more often on the Chinese team. The way he put it was it was hard to communicate with the Chinese team members because they always played like he was nearby, even if he wasn't. And so it was difficult getting that coordination and that pacing down. So I kind of feel like, in a way, making sure you can communicate with your lanes is much more important. So if you can communicate with multiple lanes as a jungler, you can communicate with top and mid, or with top and bottom. Like, often if you have this mixed language bot lane, you can communicate with at least someone in bot lane as a jungler. So I just think it's much easier to be able to, one, communicate with your coach, okay? Communicating with your coach is really important as a jungler. To understand this, because the way that I think the West approaches the jungle role is slowly changing, and as more of that levels up, it's going to come from the coaching side. So being able to communicate with your coach is really important. Being able to communicate with your lanes is very important. So these factors need to happen. So to really explain this, I should probably talk about some of the differences that I perceive between maybe really basic perceptions of how jungling works and what seems to be going on at higher levels of play based on what teams have said, based on what you can observe in games, things like that. So what seems to be a big conception is that if there's like a really sick gank where the jungler goes in at the right time, everything's works out perfectly, they get a double kill bot lane, they transition, they take the turret, they take a dragon, etc., etc. Everyone gives a lot of credit to the jungler for that, and he definitely deserves a lot of credit. But the way that a lot of these ganks really work is that you have a jungler who's signaled by his laners, who prep the wave, maybe in the middle of the lane, or in the position to create a dive, or things like this. They prep the wave beforehand, and the jungler comes. So being able to say, okay, I'm coming from this angle, like I'd like the wave to be frozen here, or I'm expecting it to be like this, is something that's like a little bit more detailed and complicated than saying I gank now, or I come bot, or things like this that probably people think is all that really needs to be said. The jungle will decide on a lot of their pathing after draft. Right now, we're in a little weird situation with the jungle where you get red and then Krugs and you have level 3, things like this. So my comments on pathing right now are probably a little bit outdated, but you get the draft, right? The draft comes out, and you have your strong lane matchups, and the jungle probably wants to path more on that side. And you have like whether or not mid can push out, things like this, like these little nuances that the jungle can use to understand when and where he can invade, what side of the map he can be on, things like that. Also, the laner will probably know a lot more about the enemy's summoner spells, the champion matchups in the lane, so they can make plans like, oh, I think this guy is gankable level 2, and then they can set up the wave like this and signal the jungle that they should come level 2 or level 3 or what have you, so that the jungle knows where to path in certain positions like this. And I think that this is something that is slowly leveling up a lot more, because we saw transformations in certain teams all year with this happen. Like, there are 3 specific examples I want to call out. The first one is H2K, because I think when you looked at H2K earlier in this year, Jankos in particular was very much kind of like a do-or-die jungler, where his ganks were like really 50-50, and he would just go, or like even more glaringly, he would go to a lane, and it seemed like it wasn't signaled beforehand that he was coming to lane, because then he would sit in the bush for a while, right? And just completely waste dead time. But now when you watch H2K games, and part of the reason why Odo and Jankos' synergy became so strong is it was very clear that when he would come to the top lane, Odo would already have the wave set up, Jankos would come, Jankos would gank, and then they would get the gank off. And there was very little time where he was just like waiting for a gank anymore. Very little things like that that you can tell they're already communicating about. They're already talking about how the game is going to play out. And Odo probably has a lot to do with like that kind of setup as well. So it's not just Jankos making the decision and going like it seemed like he used to. Then I think team solo mid is a really big example. For Svenskeren would do a lot of things that looked like blind invades. Sometimes the lanes would be pushed and he would go, and then the laners wouldn't come if he got caught in the enemy jungle. This was in spring, and I felt like this was a big reason TSM had some issues, is they were actually much more around playing around and with the jungler than anything that adding Biofrost to the roster may have done. It's just there was a lot more communication, in particular around mid, where if Svenskeren would go somewhere, Bjergsen would back him up much more, or he would go much more in sync with when Bjergsen had the lane pushed, things like this. So I think that this was a big development we saw in TSM. Another big development we saw in TSM was the jungler backing with the support much more. Like, especially in the summer, we saw much more instances where Biofrost and Svenskeren would back at the same time, right? Over a period of time, so that they could set up plays around mid or whatever, or a buff or something like that together a lot more often. And I think some of these nuances were missing from teams like G2. And having interviewed Mithy, I know that sometimes it was difficult to coordinate a little bit more of this, and this was something they developed over time as Trick learned more English. But they really lacked like some of this coordinated back timings, like syncing up between support and jungle a lot more. Next example I wanted to talk about is Invictus Gaming, because when people looked at Invictus Gaming after Kakao left, people assumed that they were just going to be really garbage because there was the kid going to the jungle meme, and that was going to be a disaster. But if you look at the way that Zatai and Rookie in particular prep the waves, it's very similar to what I was talking about with Odo Omna and Jankos on H2K. It's something that has been consistent with that team throughout the season, is where Zatai and Rookie had this weird ability to keep the wave just like almost perfectly in the middle of the lane, so that Kid could just come and gank whenever, and this is how they got Rookie ahead a lot. And this is why I think a lot of times Kid looked better than he was, is because he was able to have a lot more lane interference, just because it was just really easy. The communication on that team was really strong compared to a lot of other LPL teams, because Rookie's Chinese right now is just really, really strong. So this is why I think IG had a lot more success than was expected when they moved from Kakao to one of the weakest players on the team going to a new role in jungling, and why IG eventually just won this off-season tournament, NEST, where they beat Royal, they beat LGD. So even though Kid isn't like the best jungler, if you look at some of his individual decision makings, he's able to just get a lot more out of his ganking and a lot more out of his efficiency, because I think IG have the communication set up really good. And whenever you talk to that team, they always talk about how strong they think their communication is, in part because they all speak Chinese right now. And then you look at SK Telecom, and the way that they played with their mid and jungle was very, very, very focused on Wraith control, right? And this was a big thing, because a lot of the enemy teams would tunnel vision on getting blue buff or getting dragon or something like this. But if you focus on Wraith I'm saying right, I mean raptor control, then you can start influencing the pace and the momentum of the game much earlier, right? By getting vision so you can clear out the rivers, right? You can maybe catch the enemy jungle at his race, and by knowing when the lane is pushed by the mid, knowing your mid can react faster, and having this sort of sync up in communication helped out a lot more with these situations, which made, I think, for example, SKT much less side dependent than some other teams that relied on blue buff and bot lane dives and things like this. When you're coaching these types of setups, you need to be able to help the team set up a communication system about this. You need to get into a position where you can talk to the jungler about his pathing, where he paths when you have certain drafts, certain compositions. That's just really hard to do, even if you have a translator, I think. So I think that having a jungler who can communicate with his coach and with most of his team is actually really, really difficult in particular. All these factors, to me, when you put them together, combine so that I get the sense that what's missing in some of these NA and EU and domestic junglers isn't necessarily the sick mechanics that people are looking at Peanut for, things like that, but just this subtle nuance of understanding and communication that I don't feel like is emphasized enough when people talk about jungling in the public sphere, for one thing, and may not be emphasized as much in lower level teams or things like this. So people think that they get a sick Korean jungler who knows what to do automatically and he knows what lanes to gank and he's going to plan all this stuff out, when really you just need to be able to either set up better comms, or you don't even need like a really, really gross mechanically intense jungler, right? You just need a jungler who's going to be able to go to the right lanes at the right time, be able to talk to the team in a convincing way, because sometimes the laners can set up the lane for them, can create this momentum really, really strongly themselves, as long as they can talk to their jungler, know where he is, and know where what the plan is, and what they're doing. So instead of getting like this Korean god to come, who's probably not going to be able to make these type of same plans that he's going to make in Korea with his Korean teammates, just really working on those fundamentals is going to take you a long way, which is why I have this issue with this concept that jungler is actually the worst role domestically in NA and EU. I just feel like it's maybe not developed accurately or as sufficiently as it could be. These ideas floating around, still, you want to import a Korean jungler because you feel like he probably has these kinds of concepts already from his Korean coaches, and it's just a matter of teaching him communication. He has the sick mechanics, he has the map sense that you can observe when you watch him play in Korea, all these sorts of things. So why can't you just still import this Korean jungler? Because it'll take some ramp up time to teach other junglers these concepts anyway, to teach your team these concepts anyway, so why can't you just import a Korean jungler, wait for him to learn? I think what people see a Korean jungler do in Korea on a Korean team is not going to be the same, even if he can speak perfect English, of what he might do on an NA or EU team. And part of the reason why this is that as he's learning the language, his expectations of what was going to happen on this team probably have to be adjusted, right? You get a Korean jungler to come in and he maybe thinks he's a god, right? And he's just going to solo carry this team and they're going to win everything. And then that doesn't happen. And the same maybe emphasis on practicing all the time isn't as strong in NA or EU or China, and he gets maybe a little bit complacent, a little bit lazy. He starts playing other games without coaches to police him, things like this, and he just kind of becomes adapted to his environment. So you have a weaker mechanical jungle over time, or a less motivated jungler over time, whose expectations have changed because the team maybe didn't do as well as he thought it would, or he did much better than he expected, so he feels like he doesn't have to work as hard, and maybe they're not going to win worlds anyway, and all these other factors. And then eventually when he speaks English and he can do these coordinations, he's still not the same jungler he was, or the same jungler he saw. Whereas I feel like the NA and EU players, just like teaching them is always just going to be value added and communication added. And then if you want to import like some super sick like top laner or some super sick support, something like that, you have the slot available and you don't have to wait for this communication ramp up time or anything like this. So these are all reasons why I think it's actually the jungler is the worst role to import. I think you are much better off looking at an individual laner to import if you want to import a player with a language barrier. So I just overall really caution people from automatically thinking and looking at this Korean jungler and thinking that he's like super sick and he's going to perform the same way on an NA or EU team, and then thinking that the NA and EU jungle talent is just like really bad, when I feel like they just have to be taught a different way to think about the jungle from solo queue. That's basically all. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks a lot. If you have any feedback or anything like this, I'm probably going to continue making videos for a little while. And hope you enjoyed.